A familiar morning with shadows. The first blush of dawn cast soft hues of pink and gold across Maple Street, the quiet suburban road where Officer Timothy Evans started his daily patrol. Timothy found peace in the routine. The same roads, the same houses, and especially that one familiar yellow house with white trim on the corner. It was number 247, a modest home with a small garden that held a particular charm for him. It was the place where Maya and Emma, the energetic twin girls, lived with their mother, Rachel. Each morning at precisely 8:45 a.m., as Timothy approached the house, the twins would stand on the porch, their faces beaming, their small hands waving with boundless excitement. Maya, the more outgoing of the two, always led their greeting with big, enthusiastic waves and a contagious smile. Emma, more reserved, would watch her sister's energy spill over before shyly joining in with her own sweet smile. Timothy had grown so fond of their ritual that he began to anticipate it well before he turned onto Maple Street. Timothy's own daughter, Sarah, would have been around their age. The thought of her stirred a gentle ache in his heart, a wound from which he never fully healed. It had been nearly 3 years since she passed away in an unexpected accident, and he still found himself searching for her in the faces of every child he met. But Maya and Emma, with their morning greetings and shared innocence, had somehow lessened that pain, helping to ease the emptiness that he carried. This morning, however, was different. As Timothy approached number 247, a sense of unease began to creep in. The porch swing, which usually swayed with the girls' playful nudges or the gentle morning breeze, was empty. The house, usually filled with the activity of morning routines, was dark. The front windows had their curtains drawn, casting a shadow over the house that felt heavy, unnatural. Timothy parked his patrol car by the curb, his gaze locked on the house as he tried to shake off the gnawing feeling in his chest. He glanced at his watch. It was 8:45 a.m., the exact time when Maya and Emma should have been waving from the porch. But today, there was no laughter, no cheerful faces pressed against the glass. The silence was jarring. He checked the mailbox, still holding yesterday's mail, and noticed the morning newspaper untouched at the bottom of the porch steps. Rachel's car sat idly in the driveway, its silence matching the ominous quiet that hung in the air. Timothy had learned, in his years on the force, to trust his instincts. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, a deep-rooted instinct urging him to investigate further. Something wasn't right. He took a steadying breath, trying to ignore the pounding of his heart as he approached the front door. In the early morning stillness, he felt the weight of his fears beginning to close in. Memories of his daughter, Sarah, came rushing back, unbidden. He'd experienced a morning like this before, a morning where silence had spoken volumes, where he had found himself plunged into a nightmare he hadn't anticipated. The feeling now was too familiar, too close to home. Shaking off his personal fears, Timothy took the porch steps slowly, the creak of wood underfoot echoing loudly in the eerie silence. He tried to reassure himself that maybe they had overslept, or perhaps the girls were inside having breakfast. But his gut told him otherwise. He reached out and knocked on the door, his voice steady but urgent as he called out their names. Rachel, Maya, Emma, it's Officer Evans. Is everything okay? He waited, his ears straining for any response. But there was nothing, only the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hum of a passing car, and a silence that felt too heavy to ignore. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out once more. Still nothing. Timothy glanced at the window beside the door, hoping to catch a glimpse inside. Cupping his hands around his eyes, he pressed his face to the glass, peering through a small gap in the curtains. His heart dropped when he saw shards of glass scattered across the floor, glinting faintly in the dim light that filtered through. The living room appeared disheveled, furniture overturned, and a few picture frames lay shattered on the floor. The sight was as unsettling as it was confusing. A surge of protective instinct took over. Timothy didn't hesitate. He pulled out his radio, requesting immediate backup, then drew his weapon and kicked the door open. The sound of splintering wood seemed to shatter the silence that had settled over the house. He entered cautiously, scanning the entryway and taking in the details of the disarray before moving deeper inside. As he stepped into the living room, the scene before him became even more troubling. The furniture was scattered, a coffee table turned on its side, and a lamp lay in pieces near the edge of the rug. Picture frames that had once held cherished memories were now face down, cracked and broken. A dark stain on the wall near the overturned sofa hinted at something worse. And then he saw her. Rachel lay face down on the hardwood floor, her dark hair spread like a halo around her head. She appeared motionless, and for a horrifying moment, Timothy feared the worst. He quickly approached her, holstering his weapon as he knelt beside her, his hand shaking as he reached to check for a pulse. There it was, faint but present. Relief washed over him, though it was tempered by the awareness that whatever had happened here was far from over. Timothy radioed in for medical assistance, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. The usual detachment that his job required was slipping. His voice carried an undertone of personal fear, as if he were calling for help for his own family. He could hear the faint sound of the backup arriving, the distant wail of sirens breaking through the stillness. But even with the sounds of assistance on the way, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that continued to fill them. Something about the silence in the house, the dark rooms, the broken furniture, it all felt wrong, far beyond anything he had ever encountered. Just as he was beginning to process the scene, a faint sound reached his ears. A voice, barely more than a whisper, echoed from somewhere in the house. "Help me." The words sent a chill down Timothy's spine. The voice sounded fragile, weak, as though it belonged to someone who had lost the strength to speak. He rose to his feet, scanning the room, his ears straining to locate the source of the voice. It didn't sound like Rachel, and it certainly wasn't the voice of an adult. Timothy's heart raced as he moved down the hallway, every sense on high alert. The voice grew slightly louder as he approached a door at the end of the hall, the twins' room. The shattered silence. As Timothy approached the twins' bedroom door, every instinct he had developed over years as a police officer told him to proceed with caution. He steadied himself, his hand hovering over his holstered gun, though he hoped he wouldn't need to draw it again. The voice he had heard, fragile and haunting, seemed to come from behind this door. It echoed in his mind, faint but distinct, a plea for help that left him feeling unsettled. Slowly, he pushed open the door, bracing himself for what he might find on the other side. His heart hammered in his chest, a thudding reminder of his own vulnerability. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a nightlight in the corner, casting an eerie, bluish hue over everything. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the details. Twin beds draped in matching pink blankets, scattered stuffed animals, and a few toys strewn across the floor. It was an innocent room, a place where Maya and Emma should have been safe, where they should have felt protected. The voice, so weak yet full of desperation, had gone silent. The air felt heavy, almost as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for him to discover the source of the tragedy that had unfolded here. His gaze swept the room once more, and he noticed a small figure huddled in the far corner, barely visible beneath a blanket. The outline of the figure was unmistakable. A child, curled up tightly, as if hiding from the world. Timothy's heart ached as he approached, each step cautious but filled with purpose. He crouched down and spoke softly, not wanting to startle whoever was there. "Maya, Emma, it's Officer Evans," he said gently, his voice a comforting murmur in the stillness. "I'm here to help. You're safe now." The figure shifted slightly, and then, with a soft whimper, a face emerged from beneath the blanket. It was Emma, her wide brown eyes brimming with tears. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as she looked up at him, trying to recognize the familiar figure before her. "Officer Tim," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. She reached out a small, trembling hand, and he took it gently, his heart breaking at the sight of her fear and vulnerability. "It's okay, Emma," he assured her, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm here now. You're safe." She nodded slowly, as if she wanted to believe him, but was still trapped in whatever nightmare had unfolded around her. Her gaze flickered around the room, her little shoulders tense as she took shallow breaths. Timothy could see that she was in shock, her body trembling as she struggled to make sense of everything. "Emma, where's your sister? Where's Maya?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. Emma's face crumpled, and a fresh wave of tears spilled over her cheeks. She shook her head, unable to form words. Timothy's heart sank further. He had to tread carefully, knowing that whatever had happened here was deeply traumatic for her. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly. "Can you tell me what happened? Anything at all?" Emma swallowed, glancing toward the hallway as if afraid that speaking would somehow make things worse. She finally whispered, They took her. Maya, they took her." Her words were so quiet that Timothy almost didn't catch them, but the weight of them hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. He needed to find Maya, and he needed to understand who had come into this house and left such destruction in their wake. He knew he couldn't press Emma too hard. She was just a child, traumatized and frightened. But he had to get as much information as he could, without overwhelming her. "Emma, do you know who they are? Did you see them?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle and encouraging. She shook her head, wiping her tears with her free hand. I don't know. It was dark. They were loud, and Mama tried to stop them." Timothy's heart twisted at her words. Rachel had tried to protect her daughters, to keep them safe, but something had gone horribly wrong. He could only imagine the fear and confusion Emma must have felt, watching her mother struggle against intruders. "Did they hurt you, Emma?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked down, hugging herself as if to ward off the memory. They pushed me, and I fell. I hid here, under the blanket. Mama told me to hide." Timothy nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Rachel had done everything she could to protect her daughters, even in the face of overwhelming danger. He felt a renewed sense of urgency. Time was slipping away, and Maya was still missing. He gently lifted Emma into his arms, her tiny frame trembling against him as he carried her out of the room. As he moved through the hallway, he could hear the sounds of his fellow officers arriving, their footsteps and voices filtering into the house. Relief washed over him, knowing that backup was here and that Emma was safe, at least for the moment. Outside, he was met by Detective Lisa Monroe, a seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense demeanor. She took in the sight of Timothy holding Emma, her expression softening for a brief moment before her professional mask returned. "Tim, what happened?" she asked, glancing between him and the house. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Rachel was attacked. She's alive but unconscious. And Maya is missing." Detective Monroe's eyes widened, her expression hardening as she processed the situation. She gave Timothy a firm nod, her gaze shifting to Emma, who clung to him with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. "We'll take care of Rachel and secure the house," Monroe said, gesturing to the paramedics who were arriving. "Do you think Emma's able to talk?" Timothy hesitated, looking down at the girl in his arms. She was so small, so vulnerable, and he didn't want to put her through any more trauma. But they needed answers if they were going to find Maya. "I'll try to talk to her a little more," he said softly, giving Emma a reassuring smile. "Emma, Detective Monroe here is going to help us find your sister. You're doing so well, sweetheart. Can you be brave for me just a little longer?" Emma nodded, though her grip tightened around his shoulder, her face burying in his jacket as if drawing strength from him. Detective Monroe crouched down to Emma's level, her voice gentle but firm. "Emma, we're going to find Maya. Can you tell us anything else? Anything you remember about the people who came here?" Emma looked up, her tear-filled eyes reflecting a glimmer of hope. She whispered, They, they wore black. And they were really loud. I think they were looking for something. Detective Monroe and Timothy exchanged a glance, both processing this new piece of information. Intruders who had taken Maya, possibly for something specific. This wasn't a random break-in. It had been planned. What else? Emma. You're doing great, Detective Monroe encouraged. Emma hesitated, her brows furrowing as she tried to remember. Mama said something. She told them to leave us alone, that she didn't have what they wanted. But they didn't listen. Timothy's jaw clenched as he absorbed her words. Rachel had known these people, or at least understood what they were after. But if she didn't have it, then why would they take Maya? The weight of the situation bore down on him. He had to act fast. If the intruders had taken Maya for a reason, it meant there might still be a chance to get her back before anything worse happened. He wasn't about to let these people destroy another family, not when he could do something about it. Thank you, Emma, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You've been so brave. We're going to bring your sister home, I promise. Detective Monroe stood up, her expression steely as she addressed Timothy. We'll put out an Amber Alert and start a full investigation. If they're looking for something specific, it means we have a lead. I'll assign teams to follow up with Rachel as soon as she's conscious. But for now, finding Maya is our top priority. Timothy nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities, scenarios, and leads they could chase down. But even with the resources of the department at their disposal, he knew time was of the essence. As he looked down at Emma, who had drifted off to sleep in his arms, her small body finally succumbing to exhaustion, he made a silent vow. He would bring Maya back, no matter the cost. A desperate search begins. The midday sun was climbing higher in the sky as Detective Monroe and Timothy worked tirelessly to mobilize resources and gather every piece of information they could about the mysterious intruders who had invaded Rachel's home. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, amplifying the urgency of their mission. Timothy's heart ached, the image of the cheerful twins on their front porch haunting him. Every moment that Maya remained missing deepened his determination to bring her back. Detective Monroe had set up a makeshift command center at the edge of Maple Street. Police vehicles lined the block, officers going door to door to gather information from neighbors. Timothy, normally level-headed, felt a rare and overpowering surge of protectiveness that bordered on desperation. He had never let his personal feelings interfere with a case before, but this was different. These girls had become part of his daily life, and the thought of Maya alone, scared, and possibly hurt somewhere, was nearly unbearable. Officer Evans, Monroe called, waving him over to the tent they'd set up. We've got the Amber Alert out, and teams are scouring the area, but I want to get a jump on leads beyond this neighborhood. Timothy joined her, his face drawn but focused. What's our next step? I don't want to waste a second if it means finding her faster. Monroe studied him for a moment, her own gaze revealing a fierce determination. I was speaking with Rachel's sister, Julia. She's on her way here now. Apparently, Rachel's family had been receiving strange calls for the past few weeks, but Rachel hadn't told anyone. Only Julia knew, and even she only heard about it last night. Timothy's brow furrowed. Strange calls? What kind of calls? Julia arrived as if on cue, her face pale, and her hands trembling as she clutched her phone tightly. She was a slender woman with an air of calm that belied the worry etched into her features. Her resemblance to Rachel was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same intense gaze that looked as if they could cut through any lie. Timothy, Detective Monroe, thank you for helping my family, Julia said, her voice breaking slightly. Rachel told me something last night that I wish I had taken more seriously. She took a shaky breath, holding Timothy's gaze as she explained. Rachel said someone kept calling her, a man with a deep voice. He claimed she had something that didn't belong to her, and that she needed to give it back. She thought it was just a prank or some scammer, but she did mention he sounded agitated, almost desperate. Timothy's stomach tightened. The intruders had mentioned something similar, hadn't they? According to Emma, they were looking for something. But what could Rachel possibly have that would warrant an armed break-in and the abduction of her daughter? Julia, do you know if Rachel ever tried to find out more about who was calling her? Did she mention anything about what they might have wanted? Monroe asked, leaning forward. Julia shook her head, visibly frustrated with herself. She didn't say much, just that she didn't have anything worth stealing, nothing that anyone would go to such lengths for. Rachel has always been private, but last night she sounded genuinely scared. Timothy absorbed Julia's words, his mind racing. Could Rachel have unknowingly come into possession of something dangerous or valuable? Maybe something she didn't even realize she had. Thank you, Julia. This helps more than you know, Timothy said, his voice reassuring as he patted her shoulder. We're going to follow up on this. Do you have any idea who might want to harm Rachel or her family? Anyone from her past who might hold a grudge? Julia looked thoughtful, her gaze drifting as she racked her memory. Rachel used to work as a freelance photographer, traveling to different parts of the city. She stopped a few years ago to focus on raising the girls, but there were times she mentioned seeing things that didn't sit right with her. There was one incident about 4 years ago. She had been photographing a property for a real estate magazine, and she mentioned overhearing a conversation between two men that disturbed her. She didn't share the details, but it was enough to make her uneasy for a while. Monroe scribbled down notes, her brow furrowed. Did she report it? Or did she ever say who those men might have been? Julia shook her head. No, she brushed it off, said she was probably overreacting. But if this is connected somehow, maybe it's coming back to haunt her now. Timothy took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the situation settle over him like a weight. This wasn't just a random break-in. It was clear that Rachel's family was being targeted. He clenched his fists, the frustration building inside him. He had to act, and he had to do it fast. Just then, a call came through on his radio. Officer Evans, this is dispatch. We have a lead on the suspect's vehicle. A black van was spotted speeding through a nearby neighborhood earlier this morning. Witnesses say it didn't belong to anyone in the area and was last seen heading toward the industrial district on the east side of town. Timothy's heart pounded with renewed purpose. Roger that. I'm on my way, he replied, glancing at Monroe, who nodded in agreement. Go. I'll coordinate here and keep Julia informed. Fine, Maya, Monroe said, her voice firm. Timothy didn't waste another second. He sprinted to his patrol car, his mind racing with possibilities. If the van was heading toward the industrial area, it could mean that the intruders had a hideout there, a place where they felt safe enough to hold a child. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he sped through the city, weaving through traffic with a precision born of both training and desperation. As he neared the industrial district, he slowed down, scanning the streets for any sign of the black van. This area was filled with abandoned warehouses, crumbling buildings, and overgrown lots. It was the kind of place that could easily hide someone who didn't want to be found. He parked discreetly on the side of the road, stepping out and pulling out his binoculars to get a better look. Off in the distance, partially hidden behind a row of trees, he spotted a black van, its paint chipped and rusted in places. His pulse quickened. He called for backup, relaying his location, but he knew he couldn't wait. Every second counted. Timothy approached the van slowly, staying low and sticking to the shadows. He didn't see anyone nearby, but he stayed alert, his senses heightened. The van was empty, but there were footprints leading from it toward an old factory building nearby. He followed the trail cautiously, his heart pounding as he approached the building. The closer he got, the more he could hear, a faint murmur of voices coming from inside, the occasional scrape of metal against concrete. His hand went to his holster, his fingers brushing over his weapon as he steadied himself. He slipped into the building through a broken window, careful not to make a sound as he moved. Inside, the factory was dark, the only light coming from cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of rust. Timothy kept to the shadows, edging closer to the source of the voices. Peering around a corner, he saw them. Two men, dressed in black and speaking in hushed but intense tones. One of them was tall and lanky, with a nervous energy that suggested he wasn't comfortable with what he was doing. The other was shorter, stockier, with an air of authority that made Timothy's skin crawl. They seemed to be arguing. "We shouldn't have taken the kid," the tall one was saying, his voice laced with anxiety. "We're in over our heads, man. This is too much." The stocky man scoffed. "We wouldn't be here if that woman hadn't tried to play games. She has what belongs to us, and she'll do whatever we want if it means getting her kid back." Timothy's jaw tightened. These men were ruthless, willing to do anything to get what they wanted. He clenched his fists, anger bubbling up as he imagined Maya, scared and alone, somewhere in this building. He waited until the men walked deeper into the building before he slipped past them, his movements swift and quiet. As he made his way through the dimly lit corridors, he listened carefully for any sound that might lead him to Maya. And then he heard it, a faint whimper, coming from a room just ahead. Timothy's heart skipped a beat as he approached the door, his hand reaching for the doorknob. He twisted it gently, opening the door just wide enough to see inside. There in the corner of the room was Maya, her small frame huddled on a dirty mattress, her face streaked with tears. Her wrists were bound with a length of rope, and her eyes were red and swollen. "Maya," he whispered, his voice choked with relief. Her head snapped up, her expression shifting from fear to recognition as she saw him. "Officer Tim," she cried, her voice filled with hope. He hurried to her side, carefully untying the ropes and lifting her into his arms. She clung to him, her small hands gripping his shirt as if afraid he might disappear. "It's okay, Maya. I've got you," he whispered, holding her close. But before he could make his way out, he heard footsteps approaching. The men were coming back. A narrow escape. Timothy's heart raced as he held Maya tightly, her fragile frame trembling in his arms. The footsteps outside the door grew louder, each step echoing ominously through the abandoned factory. The men were close, too close. He scanned the room for any potential exits, his mind calculating the fastest escape route. But this room, with its peeling paint and grimy floors, offered no other way out. They were trapped. He could feel Maya's small fingers digging into his shirt, clutching him with all her remaining strength. Her face was buried in his shoulder, but he could hear her quick, shallow breaths, each one laced with fear. He placed a gentle hand on her back, whispering, "Stay quiet. Okay, Maya. I'm going to get us out of here." She nodded, her grip tightening as she fought to hold back tears. Timothy knew that silence was their only ally now. He took a steadying breath, willing his own fear into submission. His mind sharpened, going into full protective mode. He wouldn't let anything happen to Maya. He was determined to keep her safe, no matter the cost. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Timothy's stomach tightened, his fingers instinctively brushing over his holstered weapon as he prepared for the worst. He could hear the men murmuring, their voices low but tense. "Where's the kid?" "She should be in here," the shorter, stockier man said, his tone laced with impatience. "Maybe she got loose," the taller man replied, the nervousness in his voice unmistakable. "This wasn't supposed to be part of the plan. We were just supposed to scare her mom, not take a kid. This is way too risky." Timothy pressed himself and Maya closer to the wall, praying the men wouldn't enter. He could sense Maya's fear, feel her heart racing against his chest. Every instinct he had told him to protect her, to shield her from the nightmare these men had brought into her life. He didn't know how long they would hover outside, but he knew he needed a way to get Maya out without risking a confrontation. With her in his arms, a direct fight could put her at risk. Just as Timothy was considering his options, the voices outside grew louder, more heated. "Look," the shorter man growled, "I'm not leaving without that girl until we have what we came for. Rachel knows what we want, and she won't keep quiet forever. We've already crossed the line. So we might as well finish this. Are you in, or are you out?" There was a pause, and then the taller man muttered, "Fine, but we're not killing anyone. That's where I draw the line." The stockier man scoffed. "Whatever, let's just find the kid." The footsteps resumed, and Timothy's pulse quickened. The men hadn't given up. If they found Maya gone, they'd tear through the building until they found her. Timothy knew he had to act fast, and he needed to outthink them. He quickly scanned the room, his eyes landing on a large, heavy shelf along the wall. He glanced at Maya, her fearful eyes meeting his, and he offered her a reassuring smile. "Maya, I need you to be really brave, okay? Can you do that for me?" She nodded, her wide eyes filled with trust despite the terror in her face. "Good girl," he whispered. "Here's the plan. I'm going to hide you behind this shelf. I know it's dark, but I promise I won't go far. I just need to distract them so we can get out safely." A flicker of worry crossed her face, but she nodded, biting her lip as she tried to be brave. Timothy carefully set her down, guiding her to the small gap behind the shelf. He knelt down, his face close to hers, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay here and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear, okay?" She nodded again, her tiny body curling up as she pressed herself into the dark corner. Timothy touched her shoulder gently, his heart aching to leave her even for a moment, but he knew it was the safest option. He straightened, positioning himself by the door, his hand firmly on his weapon. His senses were sharp, his focus unwavering. The footsteps drew nearer until, finally, the door creaked open. The stocky man stepped into the room first, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Timothy could see the gleam of something metallic in the man's hand. A knife. The tall man followed, glancing around nervously, his shoulders tense. They hadn't seen Timothy yet, and he used that to his advantage. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence with a calm authority that caught them off guard. "Looking for something?" Timothy's voice was low, steady. The men spun around, their expressions shifting from surprise to anger as they recognized him. The stocky man's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flashing across his face. "Well, look who we have here," the stocky man sneered, gripping his knife tighter. "A little hero, come to save the day." The taller man took a step back, glancing toward the door as if considering an escape. But the stockier man shot him a glare, keeping him in place. "Where's the girl?" the stocky man demanded, his voice hard. "We're not leaving without her." Timothy met his gaze, his expression unyielding. "She's safe, and you're not getting anywhere near her. If you want to walk out of here, I suggest you leave now and forget about ever coming near her or her family again." The stocky man's face twisted into an angry sneer, and he took a step closer. "You don't scare me, cop. You're outnumbered, and you've got nowhere to run." Timothy remained calm, his eyes steady. "You're wrong about that. You're the ones with nowhere to run. Backup is already on the way, and you won't get far." The taller man's eyes widened, and he glanced anxiously at his companion. "Maybe he's right. Let's just get out of here, man. This isn't worth it." The stocky man scowled, but Timothy could see the doubt beginning to flicker in his eyes. He took advantage of the hesitation, reaching subtly for his radio and pressing the emergency call button. His backup would hear everything that followed. "Last chance," Timothy said, his voice deadly calm. "Leave now, or face the consequences." The stocky man's face twisted with rage, and he lunged forward, knife raised. Timothy sidestepped swiftly, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it with practiced precision, forcing him to drop the knife with a clatter. The taller man, clearly panicked, backed away, his hands raised as if surrendering. But the stocky man wasn't giving up. He tried to wrench his arm free, his face contorted with anger. Timothy tightened his grip, forcing the man to the ground and securing him with his handcuffs. The taller man took another step back, his voice shaking. I I didn't want any part of this. I just... Then stay put, Timothy ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The police are on their way. If you cooperate, things will go easier for you. The taller man nodded, slumping against the wall, clearly defeated. As Timothy finished restraining the stocky man, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Backup had arrived, and within seconds, a team of officers flooded the room, securing both suspects and clearing the area. Timothy finally allowed himself a sigh of relief. The men were in custody, and Maya was safe. He rose to his feet, his heart pounding with residual adrenaline, as he moved quickly to where he'd hidden her. "Maya," he called softly, peering around the shelf. "It's okay. It's over." Maya emerged slowly, her face pale but her eyes filled with relief as she saw him. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his neck, clinging to him with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "You're so brave, Maya," he whispered, holding her tightly. "I'm so proud of you." He could feel her small body relax against him, the fear finally beginning to dissipate. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her out of the room and into the daylight. Outside, Detective Monroe was waiting, her expression softening as she saw Maya in his arms, safe at last. "We've got them in custody," Monroe said, giving Timothy a nod of approval. "They'll be processed and questioned. We'll make sure they never come near her again." Timothy nodded, his relief tempered by a lingering question. Why had they taken Maya in the first place? What did they want from Rachel that had driven them to such desperate measures? As paramedics checked Maya over and police officers secured the scene, Timothy approached Monroe, his mind racing with thoughts. They mentioned that Rachel had something they wanted. They said she had something that didn't belong to her. I think we need to find out what they were after. Monroe's expression grew serious, and she nodded. "I agree. If this is about something Rachel possesses, it could mean that she's still in danger, even with these men in custody." Timothy's protective instincts flared once again. They had saved Maya, but the threat hadn't been eliminated. Not fully. Rachel and her daughters would need answers, and he was determined to find them. "Let's go talk to Rachel," he said, his voice resolute. "I need to make sure she knows everything we can uncover." Monroe nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder in support. "You did good, Tim. We'll get to the bottom of this." As Timothy looked back at Maya, who was now being gently cared for by paramedics, he felt a powerful surge of hope. He had saved her this time, but he knew the story wasn't over. They still needed to understand why her family had been targeted, and what lay ahead if they didn't find the answers quickly. With a final look of determination, he turned back toward his car, ready to confront whatever truths lay hidden in the shadows of Rachel's past. Uncovering secrets. Timothy drove to the hospital with Detective Monroe to check on Rachel and gather any information that might explain the terrifying ordeal her family had endured. Maya was safe, but the day's events had shaken Timothy to his core. The mystery behind what these men wanted and why they were willing to take a child weighed heavily on him. The thought that Rachel might still be in danger added urgency to their mission. They arrived at the hospital, where Rachel was resting under the watchful eyes of the medical staff. Julia, her sister, was seated by her bedside, her face lined with worry and exhaustion. As Timothy and Monroe entered the room, Julia rose to meet them, her expression both relieved and tense. "Officer Evans, Detective Monroe," she whispered, careful not to disturb Rachel. "Thank you for finding Maya. I can't tell you how much this means to us." Timothy gave her a reassuring nod. "We're just glad she's safe, Julia. But we need to talk to Rachel. There are still some unanswered questions, and we're concerned that she might still be in danger." Julia glanced at Rachel, who stirred at the sound of their voices, her eyes fluttering open. She looked disoriented at first, her gaze moving slowly around the room until it landed on Timothy and Monroe. A hint of recognition softened her expression, and she attempted a weak smile. "Officer Evans, Detective Monroe." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper, but her gratitude was evident. "Maya, Is she okay? Timothy moved closer, his voice gentle. She's safe, Rachel. We found her. And she's with the paramedics. She's shaken up, but she's unharmed. Rachel's shoulders relaxed as relief flooded her face, though her eyes still held a trace of fear. Thank you. Thank you so much, she murmured, her voice breaking. I was so scared. I couldn't protect them. You did everything you could, Rachel, Monroe assured her, sitting by her side. Now we need to understand what happened. Can you tell us why those men came to your house? What were they looking for? Rachel hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her face. She glanced at Julia, who reached for her hand in silent support. Timothy noticed the reluctance in her expression, as if she were grappling with a secret too heavy to share. Finally, she took a deep breath, her voice barely more than a whisper. There's something I've been hiding. It's something I never wanted to be part of, but I think it's what they were after. She paused, looking down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. About 4 years ago, when I was still working as a freelance photographer, I took an assignment photographing properties for a high-profile real estate client. I didn't know much about them, just that they paid well and wanted a quick turnaround. Monroe exchanged a glance with Timothy, encouraging Rachel to continue. One day, while I was working on one of their properties, a huge, empty mansion on the edge of town, I stumbled onto something. At first, I thought it was nothing, just boxes and crates left behind by the previous owners. But when I looked closer, I realized the crates were filled with money, stacks of it, neatly organized and wrapped in plastic. Timothy felt a jolt of surprise. Money? You mean cash? Rachel nodded, her expression haunted. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'd never seen so much cash in my life. I knew it was suspicious, but I didn't want to get involved. I told myself to just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But then, I heard voices. There were 2 men in the next room, talking about a deal and how they'd move the money. Her voice grew shaky as she recalled the details. I knew I shouldn't have stayed, but I was curious. I listened to them, and that's when I heard them mention my client's name, Marcus Blackwell. They said he was involved in something huge, something dangerous. They called it the operation. I didn't understand what they meant, but I knew it wasn't legal. I managed to slip out of the house before they saw me, and I tried to forget about it. I told myself it wasn't my problem. Monroe's eyes narrowed as she processed Rachel's story. Did you report this to anyone? The police, or maybe your client? Rachel shook her head, her expression clouded with regret. No, I was too scared. I had young daughters to think about. I thought if I just stayed quiet, I'd be safe. But a few weeks later, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside, there were photos of me, leaving the mansion. Someone had been watching me. There was no message, just the photos. Timothy felt a chill as he imagined the fear Rachel must have felt. So they knew you'd seen something. And now, 4 years later, they're coming after you. Rachel nodded, her face pale. I never heard from them again after that, so I thought they'd moved on. But a month ago, I received a phone call. The man on the other end had a deep voice, cold and demanding. He said I had something that didn't belong to me. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, but he insisted that I had taken something from that house. Julia interjected, her voice filled with worry. But Rachel, you didn't take anything. You just saw what they were doing. Rachel looked down, her expression conflicted. That's what I thought too. But then, a week after the call, I found an old camera memory card in my drawer. It must have been from that day, from when I was photographing the mansion. I never reviewed the photos. I just tucked the card away, intending to process it later. But life got busy, and I forgot about it. Monroe's gaze sharpened. Do you still have the memory card? Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, I didn't want to look at it. I was too scared. But I kept it, hidden in a safe place. I thought maybe it would be a good backup in case anything ever happened." Timothy exchanged a look with Monroe, both of them realizing that the memory card could be the key to everything. "Rachel, that card might hold evidence of their illegal activities. If these men think it's in your possession, that would explain why they're coming after you." Rachel took a shaky breath, clutching Julia's hand tightly. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to do my job, to support my family. But now, they took Maya. They threatened my family. I don't know what to do." Timothy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Rachel, you did nothing wrong. These men put you in this position, and now we're going to make sure they pay for it. But we need that memory card. It might be the evidence we need to take them down." Rachel nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll get it for you. It's hidden in the lining of my camera bag at home." Monroe rose, already making plans. "We'll send a team to retrieve it. Don't worry, Rachel. We'll keep you and your family safe." Just as they began to finalize the plan, an officer entered the room, his expression grim. "Detective Monroe, Officer Evans, you're going to want to hear this." Timothy's heart sank as he followed the officer into the hallway, Monroe close behind. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. The officer handed them a file. "We just got word from our surveillance team. The men we apprehended in the factory. They've been identified. One of them is associated with Marcus Blackwell's organization. Blackwell has a reputation for eliminating anyone who threatens his operations, and he's ruthless. These guys, they won't stop until they get what they want." Timothy clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. Blackwell's reach was extensive, and his reputation was as dark as they came. Timothy knew they were dealing with a powerful criminal who wouldn't hesitate to target Rachel's family again if he thought the memory card was still out there. Monroe's expression hardened. "Then we need to move fast. We'll put Rachel and her daughters into protective custody. If Blackwell thinks they have something on him, he won't stop until he finds them." Timothy nodded, his determination renewed. "And we'll make sure that memory card gets processed as soon as it's in our hands. If it has anything on it that links Blackwell to illegal activity, we'll finally have the leverage to bring him down." They returned to Rachel's room to inform her of the plan. Her face was a mix of fear and gratitude as they outlined the steps they'd take to protect her family. She looked down at her hands, her voice wavering as she spoke. "I never wanted this to happen. I thought if I just stayed quiet, they'd forget about me. But they didn't, did they?" Timothy's expression softened. "Sometimes silence isn't enough, Rachel. People like Blackwell don't forget. But now we have a chance to stop him. With your help, we can make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." Rachel nodded, her fear replaced with a quiet resolve. "Then let's do it. I'm tired of living in fear. If this memory card can help, I'll do whatever it takes." Monroe gave her an encouraging smile. "We'll take it from here, Rachel. Just stay strong and trust us." As they left the hospital room, Timothy felt a renewed sense of purpose. The stakes were higher than ever, but they had a chance to dismantle a dangerous operation and protect an innocent family. The memory card could hold the key to exposing Blackwell's activities, and Timothy was determined to see justice served. Outside, as he and Monroe coordinated with their team, he looked back at the hospital, feeling a deep responsibility for the family inside. He had come to care about them, to feel as if they were part of his own world, and he knew he wouldn't rest until Blackwell was behind bars and Rachel and her daughters could live without fear. They would move quickly, and they would protect Rachel's family. But above all, they would bring down the man who had torn their lives apart. Confronting the shadows, the drive to Rachel's home was tense. Timothy and Monroe sat in silence, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts. They knew that retrieving the memory card could be their last, best chance to take down Marcus Blackwell and his criminal enterprise, but they also knew that any misstep could put Rachel's family at further risk. Blackwell had proven he was willing to go to terrifying lengths to protect his operation, and if he suspected that Rachel still had something incriminating, He would stop at nothing to recover it. As they neared Rachel's house, Monroe spoke, breaking the silence. "We need to assume Blackwell has people watching her place. If he's aware of any police presence here, he might accelerate his plans. We have to move fast and get out before anyone knows we're there." Timothy nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Agreed. We'll go in and grab the memory card as quickly as possible. I'll search Rachel's camera bag, and you keep an eye on the perimeter. Let's hope we're in and out before anyone notices." They parked a block away and made their way to the house, moving quietly through the shadows, their senses heightened with tension. The house sat in eerie silence, its usual warmth overshadowed by the day's traumatic events. As Timothy and Monroe slipped inside, he was struck by the contrast between the serene, lived-in home and the violence that had intruded on it just hours ago. He steeled himself, focusing on the mission ahead. Timothy located Rachel's camera bag, which had been left in the living room, partially concealed beneath an end table. He carefully unzipped it, feeling along the inner lining where Rachel had said she'd hidden the memory card. His fingers brushed against something small and rectangular, and he carefully pulled it out. It was the memory card, slightly worn but intact. He held it up to the dim light filtering through the drawn curtains, feeling a rush of relief. "This is it," he whispered to Monroe, who was watching the front door. She nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Good. Let's get back to the station and see what's on it," she replied, her voice tense but steady. As they turned to leave, Timothy froze. Outside, the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel reached his ears, followed by the low hum of an idling engine. He glanced at Monroe, whose face mirrored his own concern. They exchanged a silent look. They needed to leave now. But it was too late. A sharp knock echoed through the front door, and Timothy and Monroe quickly ducked out of sight, moving to the shadows near the hallway. They could see the silhouette of a man standing on the porch, his stance casual but his presence menacing. He knocked again, his voice muffled but carrying a tone of authority. "Rachel, I know you're in there. Open up. Let's talk," the man called, his voice deceptively calm. Timothy felt a surge of anger as he recognized the voice. It was Marcus Blackwell himself. He was here, at Rachel's home, demanding access. Timothy exchanged a glance with Monroe, who was gripping her weapon, her expression taut with resolve. Blackwell had brought trouble right to Rachel's doorstep. "Rachel, I'm losing my patience," Blackwell continued, his tone hardening. "You have something that belongs to me, and I want it back. We don't have to make this difficult. Let's be reasonable." Timothy felt his pulse quicken. Blackwell wasn't just trying to scare her. He was here to recover the memory card, no doubt planning to destroy any evidence it contained. They needed to act quickly, but charging out the front door would put them at a disadvantage. Monroe leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "He probably has backup with him. We can't go out the front." Timothy nodded, scanning their surroundings for another way out. The house had a back door that led into the yard, partially obscured by trees. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best option. He gestured for Monroe to follow him, clutching the memory card tightly in his hand as they moved swiftly toward the kitchen, where the back door was located. They were almost there when they heard the front door creak open, followed by Blackwell's footsteps. He was inside. Timothy glanced over his shoulder, his heart racing as he caught a glimpse of Blackwell moving through the living room, his gaze sweeping the area. Blackwell's demeanor was calm, even as he searched the home with a methodical precision that made it clear he wouldn't leave without what he'd come for. Timothy and Monroe slipped out the back door, moving quickly but quietly into the yard. The cool night air greeted them, and they felt a brief surge of relief, until they saw a second figure waiting by the fence. It was one of Blackwell's men, a tall, muscular man with a watchful gaze. He turned as they exited the house, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of them. Monroe reacted instantly, raising her weapon and calling out in a firm voice, "Police, stay where you are." The man's expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and defiance. He reached for something inside his jacket, a gun. But Monroe didn't hesitate. She fired, aiming for his shoulder to incapacitate him. The shot rang out, and the man staggered back, clutching his shoulder as he slumped to the ground. Timothy grabbed Monroe's arm, pulling her toward the gate. "Let's go. We need to get to the car before Blackwell realizes what's happening." They dashed through the yard, slipping through the gate and running toward their car, which was still parked a block away. The night was quiet save for the pounding of their footsteps and the distant wail of sirens. They had called for backup before entering the house, and the cavalry was on its way. But Blackwell wouldn't wait around. He would either pursue them or disappear into the night, taking his secrets with him. As they reached the car, Timothy glanced back, half expecting to see Blackwell charging after them. But the yard was empty, and the only sound was the faint murmur of city life beyond the neighborhood. He and Monroe piled into the car, and he sped off, putting distance between them and Rachel's house as quickly as possible. Timothy's hands gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. They had narrowly escaped, but the memory card was safe. Now, it was time to find out what secrets it held. Back at the police station, Timothy and Monroe headed directly to the tech lab, where a forensics technician was waiting to help them process the card. Timothy handed it over, his pulse racing with anticipation and dread. If this card contained evidence linking Blackwell to illegal activity, it would be the breakthrough they needed. But if it didn't, they'd be left with little more than the memory of a dangerous man slipping through their fingers. The technician inserted the card into a computer, and the screen flickered to life, revealing dozens of photo files. The images loaded slowly, one by one, each frame capturing a different angle of the mansion Rachel had photographed. Timothy and Monroe leaned forward, watching as the images revealed empty rooms, grand staircases, and abandoned furnishings. But then, as they reached the end of the series, the photos took a darker turn. One of the images showed a group of men gathered in a dimly lit room, their faces partially obscured but unmistakable in their intent. Stacks of cash lined the table before them, along with documents, ledgers, and a duffel bag filled with firearms. Timothy's stomach churned as he recognized Marcus Blackwell in the center of the group, his face partially turned toward the camera, a cold smirk on his lips. "This is it," Monroe murmured, her voice laced with awe and anger. "This is exactly what we needed." But the revelations didn't end there. As they flipped through the images, more incriminating details came to light. Conversations captured on Rachel's hidden camera, showing Blackwell discussing shipments, payments, and plans for expansion. He talked openly about bribing officials, hiding assets, and silencing anyone who posed a threat to his operation. It was a damning record, a treasure trove of evidence that could finally bring him to justice. Timothy felt a surge of triumph as he watched the images unfold. They had the proof they needed to dismantle Blackwell's empire, to bring him down for good. But the weight of responsibility pressed down on him too. Blackwell was dangerous, and the fight wasn't over yet. They'd have to move quickly and carefully, or Blackwell would retaliate. "Get this processed and backed up immediately," Monroe instructed the technician, her voice firm, "and put out a warrant for Blackwell's arrest. We're bringing him in." Within hours, a coordinated effort was underway. Teams were dispatched to Blackwell's known locations, armed with arrest warrants and the authority to seize any assets linked to his operation. Timothy and Monroe joined the effort, determined to see it through to the end. They arrived at Blackwell's primary residence just before dawn, the sky tinged with the first light of morning. Officers surrounded the property, securing every exit. As Timothy moved into position, he saw Blackwell emerge from the house, flanked by two of his men. His face registered surprise, then cold fury as he took in the scene. "You think this will stop me?" Blackwell sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Monroe stepped forward, her gaze unyielding. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with," Blackwell, "and we have enough evidence to put you away for a long, long time." Blackwell's smirk faltered as he took in the determination in their faces. He glanced around, realizing that his escape routes were cut off. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his eyes. "Take him," Monroe ordered, her voice steady. Officers moved in, handcuffing Blackwell and leading him toward the patrol car. As they drove him away, Timothy felt a wave of relief wash over him. The nightmare was finally ending, and Rachel and her daughters would be safe. Back at the station, as the team celebrated their victory, Timothy took a moment to reflect. He'd fought hard to bring justice to a family that had come to mean something to him, and he knew he'd carry the memory of this case for a long time. Later that day, Timothy visited Rachel at the hospital, bringing Maya with him to reunite her with her mother. Rachel's face lit up as she embraced her daughter, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. "Thank you, Officer Evans," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my family. I'll never be able to repay you." Timothy smiled, his heart full. "You don't need to. Just knowing that you're safe is enough. Take care of each other, and don't let fear rule your lives. You're free now." As he left the hospital, Timothy felt a deep sense of peace. He had honored his duty as a protector, bringing a powerful criminal to justice and restoring safety to a family he had come to care about deeply. It was a victory, not just for him, but for every person who had ever lived in fear of someone like Marcus Blackwell. And as he walked back to his patrol car, the morning sun casting warm light across the streets of Maple Street, Timothy felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing he would always be there to fight for the innocent, no matter the cost. The truth unveiled. With Marcus Blackwell finally in custody and his criminal operation under scrutiny, Timothy felt a sense of accomplishment, but he also knew that Rachel's family would still have a long road to recovery. He couldn't shake the images of Rachel's terrified daughters, or the memory of how close they had come to losing everything. For Timothy, this case had become more than a job. It had turned into a mission to protect a family he had come to care for deeply. The evidence on the memory card had exposed Blackwell's extensive web of illegal activities, from money laundering to arms trafficking, bribery, and intimidation. The city's media was abuzz with the details, and Timothy and Detective Monroe had become local heroes. However, they both knew the journey was far from over. Now that Blackwell was behind bars, it was time to ensure his associates were held accountable as well. The day after Blackwell's arrest, Timothy visited Rachel's home to check in on her and her daughters. Although they were under police protection, he knew that the trauma they had endured would linger long after the officers and reporters left. Rachel had been discharged from the hospital the night before, and she was now trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. When he arrived, he found her sitting on the front porch, looking out at the neighborhood with a distant, thoughtful expression. Maya and Emma were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was a beautiful sound, one that filled Timothy with relief and a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel looked up as Timothy approached, a tired but grateful smile spreading across her face. "Officer Evans," she said softly. "Or should I say Timothy?" He chuckled, appreciating her familiarity. "Timothy's just fine. I came by to see how you're all holding up. It's been a rough few days." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It has. But I think we're going to be okay. For the first time in years, I feel like I don't have to look over my shoulder. Like my girls are finally safe." They sat together in a comfortable silence, watching the twins chase each other through the yard. Finally, Rachel turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I want to thank you, Timothy," she said quietly. "You went above and beyond for us. You didn't have to, but you did." Timothy looked down, humbled by her words. "I only did what any good officer would do. You and your girls deserve a life free from fear, Rachel. I just wish we could have stopped Blackwell sooner." She shook her head, her expression resolute. "You stopped him when it mattered. And because of you, my daughters still have their mother, and I still have my girls. That's more than I could have hoped for. Timothy felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had carried the weight of this case for so long, but hearing Rachel's words reminded him of why he had chosen this path. He watched Maya and Emma, their laughter filling the yard, and he felt a renewed sense of commitment to his duty. "Timothy," Rachel said softly, breaking the silence, "there's something else I need to tell you." He looked at her, noticing the hesitance in her expression. She seemed to be grappling with something, as if uncertain whether to share it. "When I was at the hospital," she began, "I had a lot of time to think about everything. About why Blackwell was so desperate to get that memory card back. And I remembered something." Timothy leaned forward, his attention fully on her. "What did you remember?" Rachel took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on a distant point in the yard. 4 years ago, when I took those photos, I overheard something else. It was a conversation between Blackwell and one of his associates. They were talking about Phase 2, something they were planning that involved a lot more than just money. It sounded like they were planning something big, something that would affect a lot of people. Timothy felt a chill run down his spine. Did they say anything specific? Anything about what this plan entailed? She shook her head, frustration evident in her expression. No, they were careful with their words. But Blackwell mentioned a timeline. He said something like, "When the time is right, everything will fall into place." I thought it was just vague business talk, but now, I'm not so sure. What if there's more to his operation than we realized? Timothy's mind raced. Blackwell's arrest had been a major victory, but if he had been planning something larger, something that could still be in motion, they needed to act fast. He took out his phone, making a note to contact Detective Monroe and the task force as soon as possible. "Rachel, this information is crucial. I'm going to make sure our team looks into it immediately," he assured her. "If there's a larger operation underway, we'll find it and put a stop to it." Rachel nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you. I couldn't keep this to myself, not after everything that's happened. I don't want anyone else to go through what we did." Timothy gave her a reassuring smile. "You did the right thing, Rachel. And I promise we'll get to the bottom of this." Just then, Maya and Emma ran over, their faces flushed with excitement. They looked up at Timothy, their eyes filled with the same boundless energy that had first drawn him to them. "Officer Tim," Maya exclaimed, using the nickname she had given him. "Are you going to keep visiting us?" He smiled, crouching down to their level. "I think you're going to see me around a lot, Maya. But you don't have to call me Officer Tim. Just Tim is fine." Emma, the quieter twin, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Thank you for helping Mama and us," she said shyly, reaching out to hug him. Timothy's heart swelled as he hugged her back. These girls, with their innocence and resilience, had become like family to him. He couldn't imagine not being part of their lives now, even after the case was closed. After a few more minutes of chatting and laughing with the twins, Timothy rose to leave. He promised Rachel he would stay in touch and keep her updated on any new developments in the case. As he walked back to his car, he glanced over his shoulder to see Rachel watching him, her expression one of quiet gratitude. The next day, Timothy met with Detective Monroe and their team to discuss Rachel's revelation. Monroe's face grew serious as she listened, her mind already racing with possibilities. "If Blackwell was planning something larger, we need to dig deeper into his finances, his contacts, and any recent transactions. There might be more layers to his operation than we thought," Monroe said, her tone determined. They divided the tasks among the team, focusing on unraveling any remaining threads of Blackwell's criminal enterprise. For the next several days, Timothy pored over documents, combed through digital files, and interviewed former associates of Blackwell. Each piece of information led them closer to understanding the full extent of his operation, but one detail remained elusive: the specifics of Phase 2. As the investigation unfolded, Timothy discovered that Blackwell's reach extended far beyond their city. He had connections in multiple states, and his network included influential figures who were deeply embedded in industries that could easily be exploited for criminal gain. The more they uncovered, the more Timothy realized that Blackwell had built an empire of corruption. Finally, a breakthrough came. An informant, a former accountant for Blackwell's operation, agreed to cooperate in exchange for protection. He provided documents detailing a series of offshore accounts and a planned transaction involving a large shipment of illegal arms. Monroe and Timothy studied the documents, their expressions grim as they realized what they were dealing with. Blackwell's Phase 2 was not just a criminal operation. It was a plot to funnel illegal weapons into vulnerable communities, creating chaos and fear to expand his influence. It was a horrifying plan, one that would have destabilized entire neighborhoods. With this new evidence, the team moved swiftly. They coordinated with federal agencies, executing raids on Blackwell's remaining hideouts and seizing his assets. The operation was complex and dangerous, but after weeks of relentless work, they dismantled Blackwell's empire piece by piece. Every associate, every hidden account, every trace of his influence was brought to light and shut down. At the end of it all, Timothy felt a profound sense of relief. They had stopped Blackwell's plans, preventing untold suffering, and Rachel's family could finally live in peace, free from his shadow. Months later, Timothy returned to Rachel's neighborhood, where life had returned to normal. As he parked his car, he saw Maya and Emma playing on the front porch, their laughter echoing across the yard. Rachel waved at him from the doorway, her face filled with warmth and gratitude. He walked up the path to greet them, feeling the joy of being among friends who had become like family. Rachel offered him a cup of coffee, and they sat on the porch, watching the twins play. "Thank you, Timothy," Rachel said, her voice full of sincerity. "You saved us. You didn't just protect us from Blackwell. You gave us hope, a chance to live without fear." Timothy looked at her, his heart full. "You gave me something, too, Rachel. You reminded me why I do this job, why it's worth the fight." They sat in comfortable silence, a shared understanding between them. For Timothy, this case had changed everything. It had reminded him of the power of connection, of the bonds that could be formed through simple acts of kindness, like a wave from two little girls on a front porch. And as he watched Maya and Emma play, he knew that his life, too, had been changed forever. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Timothy knew that he would always be there for them, just as they had been there for him. They had found strength together, overcoming fear and facing the future with resilience. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter and love, Timothy felt truly at peace, ready to face whatever challenges life had yet to bring.